This is a second video, much after the first one, because of some questions that I received on my last post. I'm going to dig into a particular example of property casualty claims, which is useful to people in the domain, but also people outside the domain. I hope we can all understand the basic context of an insurance claim, unfortunately. And the terminology I'm going to try to utilize here is separating peripheral and core activities of any job, of any knowledge worker job. And the reason I'm going to do this is because I think that today's artificial intelligence is more applicable out of the box anyways to the peripheral activities of a knowledge worker as opposed to the kind of core judgmental activities of a knowledge worker. And I'll be defining what these terms mean. The whole idea here is that sort of out of the box, AI can do some pretty powerful things. Large language models I'm speaking of in particular here. For example, we can ask AI based on some subset of information about a property casualty claim to create an interview script when we go talk to one of the witnesses and collect information from that witness. And, that does require some context, but it's also something that's easily within the generative capabilities of the tools. Other examples of what I think of as peripheral activities might be summarizing certain documents, like summarizing a police report, and even geospatial type data, as well as visual type data, can be categorized in this area, and we can use the large language model and expanded AI tool set, with very little customization. I'm contrasting this intentionally with what I call kind of the core activities, which are the higher judgmental activities of any knowledge worker. And I'll be using claims as an example here, but I'm sure you can make it apply in your domain. And I refer to these as harder in the sense that they, generally speaking, are at the heart of what you're being paid to do as a knowledge worker. And it's clear that the solutions available to us today in the generative AI space require a lot more customization. And as I said in my last post, I'm a little skeptical that today's models can just use fine tuning and prompting to get us where we want to be on some of these harder core activities that require more judgment. But, models continue to be released, and we'll see how those models advance. What that implies is that you might need to do things beyond fine tuning, which means getting into the pre-training regime or having a pre-trained model that's general, and then maybe some specialized ones that work with it to handle particular aspects of an assessment. The model I use, as you know, if you follow my previous posts, is very much one of the collaborator, that AI is a collaborator to a knowledge worker, not a replacement for a collaborator. And I think this is an area where I would be experimenting if I were in this particular realm. So the knowledge worker of a claim handler obviously is very important to an insurance company, and I like to decompose what a claim handler does into some key judgments that are made. And I don't want to make it sound like these judgments occur at a specific point in time because, clearly they are constantly being reevaluated on complicated claims in particular. But the kind of core judgments that I think are harder are judgments like, should we even cover this claim? To what degree are we liable, or is our insured liable for third-party damages? What are the likely economic and non-economic damages? So the evaluation of the claim. What negotiation strategy and approach should we follow? And if we've already received a demand letter, we have some urgency there. And then, lastly, looking at what opportunities do we have to recover some of the financial amounts through salvage and subrogation and the like. And so, I'm sure I'm missing some there, but to me, those are the five core judgments of a claim organization. I'm not specifically calling out reserves and other things because I put them into the valuation bucket. So I'm going to divert a little bit deeper on the first determination of should we even cover the claim. And the context here is very important. We need to have the actual insurance policy, which may or may not apply to the claim. We need to understand the legal environment because there's different statutory as well as jurisdictional precedents that will dictate how we handle the claim and maybe affect how we handle it if they're not dictating terms of how we handle it. And then there's also the facts of loss. And facts of loss sounds simple, but it really is complicated because it can end up being multiple perspectives from multiple sources. Sometimes sources change their stories, and there might be different degrees of evidence and things like that come in over different times. So, in and of itself, the facts of loss is a pretty complex determination in court of what a claim handler does. The other dimension I wanted to kind of cover here is a general framework that I like to use when thinking about the core judgments of a knowledge worker's job. I like to plot out the complexity of the judgment on one dimension and the payload of the actual decision on another dimension. And I'll probably use dollars as a shortcut for payload of decisions, but certainly other factors can and should be considered as part of that. When I think of complexity, I look at the breadth of knowledge and information needed to make the judgment, to make the decision. I look at the amount of depth that the assessment has to encounter. Now, sometimes with more information, you get into more depth, but some decisions, regardless of the type of information you have and the quantity of information you have, can be pretty shallow ultimately as well. And then lastly, the novelty of the situation, either for the individual claim handler assigned the claim or for the claim organization and the jurisdiction as a whole. It might be a novel situation, in which case you have to treat it with special handling. So in my mind, coverage determination is something that is very often towards the lower left-hand side, that there's a degree of payload involved. Of course, if you deny coverage, you can be accused of mishandling of the claim and have to pay extraordinary damages beyond the terms of the contract. But bad faith claims are something that we have to be aware of, and so the payload of the decision could be larger than you think it's going to be. And then the complexity of the judgment, in my experience with coverage determination in general, is somewhere between the low end and the middle end of all the judgments that a claim handler has to make. Not that there aren't exceptions that fall outside this box, but to me, thinking of it this way and plotting the other determinations on these dimensions is a very useful thing. And to really get into a collaborator or a co-pilot to help a claim handler make coverage determination questions, a lot of people are starting off by saying, look, let me take the really easy ones and make those and just kind of almost force those into a process. So when a claim handler gets it, they might immediately find out that the system has decided that this is a claim that is covered or isn't covered. And then situations outside the simplest situations are left up to the claim handler. Sometimes the technology does very little to support them in that process. I like more of an end-to-end perspective where the technology, can guide them on the simple claims to make a quicker decision and be able to rationalize quickly why they're making that decision. We don't want them to just default to what the system is doing. We want them to continue to have responsibility for the coverage determination. But as we get into more complicated coverage determinations, it's very critical that the system provides them sort of a elastic sort of support so that it doesn't just drop them when the claim gets complicated, but it helps them structure their thinking about how to evaluate coverage in this more complex situation. Let's say if there's particular language in a bespoke contract that is directly germane, that's where they need quite a bit of support, and large language models will be able to do that in time. You might need to jump over to a legally trained or a legally fine-tuned large language model to help with some of those decisions. But again, we're collaborating with the claim handler, and we might, for medical things, might need to jump over into a medically trained large language model as an example. So this is just meant to be a touch into the space, how I think about the space based on the questions that I received. I wanted to also just repeat a couple things from the last video. One is that I want to just reemphasize how important I think it is that you as a professional understand, how the technology works here, not just what it can do, but also how it works. I think that's never been more important. And we've gotten by letting the IT people or letting the technology people like myself understand the details. But going forward, I think any manager in an organization, including senior managers, need to really appreciate how the technology is working to give them some instinct about how to trust it and when to trust it and when not to trust it. The other thing I also wanted to reiterate is that there's a set of NLP subtasks that are very relevant here, and probably something that, this list is being expanded. There's some rational thinking, common sense type things that are not strictly not NLP, that the NLP systems can actually do pretty well. But it's really important when you're thinking about both the peripheral and the core activities of a claim handler or any knowledge worker that we realize that some of these NLP subtasks are in that peripheral space and can be very powerful. But Gen AI is not going to have the headline impacts if we just stay at the periphery. We have to get to the core, and yet from the handful of conversations I've had, I think people are hoping that they can work their way into the core from the periphery. I'm not convinced that that's really what's going to happen here. I think they want to declare that they're playing with and using Gen AI, and they're just demonstrating it to people on the periphery, which I think is ultimately going to leave them disappointed. And I think they need to get into the core judgments of knowledge activities and explore how AI can support the knowledge worker. Thank you.